Hi, welcome to Evita Studio. My name is Elizabeth, and today I'm going to be talking about seam allowances. So the seam allowance is the amount of fabric that's left on the inside. So I have this piece here that's joined together, but on the inside, the part beyond the seam is a seam allowance. And I'm sure that if you've been quilting any amount of time, you know that the standard in quilting is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you've probably even heard things like scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that is the ideal. That is like the perfect thing that quilt patterns are designed around. But how important is it that you have an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance? Because that is something that a lot of people struggle with. And the answer to that question is the answer that my kids hate to get when they ask me something. It depends. There are some times when it's more important than other times. So today I'm going to talk about 5 things that will affect how important seam allowance is to the project that you're working on. The first thing that will affect how important seam allowance is the type of project that you're doing. If you're doing improv piecing, where you're just taking random pieces and stitching them together, or you have a foundation and you're piecing strips on there, then accurate seam allowance isn't really that important at all. You have a bit of flexibility. So you can use that as a practice project to try and get accurate 1/4 inch seam allowances, but it doesn't have to be exact for that project to work out. If you're doing simple traditional piecing, especially things like a fence rail block or a 9-patch block or a log cabin block, those, it's kind of important. You want to try and get an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, but if you're off a little bit, you can usually correct that as you go. If you make log cabin blocks and they're supposed to be 12.5 inches, but they're not quite, what you can do is take your blocks, measure them, find out which one is the smallest, and then cut all your other blocks to be that size, and then put them together. And your finished project is still going to be great. So it is a little bit important, but you can kind of work around things if it doesn't go exactly. If you want to make intricate traditional piecing, and I'm thinking things with a lot of corners, a lot of triangles, diamonds, then it becomes much more important. And so the more intricate the block is, the more important a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance is. Another thing that is going to help determine how exact your seam allowance has to be is the technique that you were using. If you're doing traditional piecing where you cut the pieces and then stitch them together, then you need to have a pretty good 1/4 inch seam allowance, because the 1/4 inch is built into the size of the pieces that you cut. So if you're not stitching them accurately, then the next size is not going to be correct, and the next size, and everything is not going to work out. Things aren't going to line up. It's going to be thrown off. But if you're doing something like paper piecing, in either foundation paper piecing or English paper piecing, then your seam allowance is not really important at all, because in those techniques, you're focused on the stitching line. That is what everything's based on, and not the cutting line with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you were doing reversible patchwork with a modern Projagi seam, then that doesn't require an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. In fact, the seam allowances are bigger than a 1/4 inch, and it's a whole different ballgame with this technique. So a lot of people find it freeing to try this technique because the seam allowances are so different. There are also techniques where you cut the pieces a bit bigger than you need, and after you stitch them together, then you trim them down. And this is really common, especially with triangles, like half square triangles and flying geese. And for that situation, you want to be careful with seam allowances, but it has a little bit of correction built in. So if you're a bit off, then you can fix it as you go. That's always a nice help if you have trouble getting an exact 1/4 inch seam allowance. Another thing that will impact the importance of seam allowance is the scale of the piece that you're working on. Now, scale, I'm talking about two things, the number of pieces and the size of the pieces. So if you have, for example, a 12-inch block and it has only 4 pieces, 2 across and 2 down, that's only one seam in the middle both ways. So if that seam allowance is off by 1/8 of an inch, the whole block is going to be off by 1/8 of an inch. But if you have a 12-inch block and it has 12 pieces across and 12 pieces down, and each of those seams is off by 1/8 of an inch, your finished block size is going to be off by almost 1.5 inches. So the number of pieces really has an impact for how accurate you have to be. Also, it goes along with the number is the size of the pieces. If you want to make tiny little 3 or 4-inch star blocks, then those seam allowances have to be exact. The smaller you are, the more accurate you have to be. If you're making 15 and 16-inch quilt blocks, you have a little bit more leeway with that. Something else that determines the importance of seam allowance is the purpose of your finished project. So if you're planning on entering it in a show or you want to compete, then you're going to have exact 1/4-inch seam allowances. But not every quilt has to be show quality. There's a wide range of reasons why you might make a quilt. And so you'll have to consider how much is going to matter if your corners don't line up or if you have a point chopped off a little bit. So what it all comes down to in the end is your own personal comfort level with imperfection. Everybody has their own level of quilting OCD. Some people will spend half of their project ripping out seams because they want them to be exact, and other people don't really care. They just want to pump out quilts as fast as they can, and they don't want to be hung up on that. So quilting should be fun, relaxing, and enjoyable. So you need to find what is the good spot for you. If you want to spend all your time trying to get exact perfect quilts and enter them in shows and win ribbons, that's great. Everybody will love to see your beautiful work that you do. If you find that stressful and a burden, then work towards a perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance, but don't be stressed by the imperfection. Give yourself a chance to practice, to learn, to get better, and realize that even imperfect things can be beautiful and useful. I'm probably in the middle. I really like to have things line up, but I also really don't like ripping things out. So depending on the project, then I will give myself a distance test. So for example, on this piece, you can see, if you're looking really close, this corner doesn't line up. So should I rip it out or should I just leave it? Well, as I back up, I realize, the further back you get, the less noticeable it is. And since this is going to be a baby quilt, I don't think absolute perfection is required. It can still be beautiful. It can still be used and loved, even if I leave that imperfect corner in there. So think about all the different things and relax and give yourself a chance to learn, to grow, and to enjoy making imperfect things. So keep working toward an accurate 1/4-inch seam allowance, but don't beat yourself up if it's not exact. And whatever you do, don't give up quilting because you're frustrated with it. Just try a different technique or a different project and you'll find the one that works for you. If you want some tips on how to get an accurate seam allowance, check out my other video. And if you want more tips and tricks and inspiration, check out ebitastudio.com.